The gavel came down at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning in November, and the sound of it carried across the courthouse steps like a gunshot. Declan Marsh heard it from across the street. He was sitting in the cab of a borrowed pickup truck, a paper cup of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder, and Sargent at his feet, pressing his broad skull against the floorboard as if he understood that something was happening that he could not fix. The shepherd had been still like that for 20 minutes, since they had turned onto Birch Street and Declan had stopped the truck without saying a word. The house was a yellow clapboard, 2-story with a porch that needed new boards, and a flagpole out front where an American flag hung limp in the gray November air. The kind of house that had once meant something, the kind of house that still did, to someone, somewhere, even if that someone was not inside it anymore. A man in a wool overcoat was already walking down the front steps with a clipboard, and behind him 2 county officials Declan did not recognize were taping a notice to the front door. Sargent lifted his head. He did not growl. He made a lower sound than that, something that lived in the chest, and he looked at Declan with dark, patient eyes that had the quality of asking a question the dog already knew the answer to. If this story stays with you, take a moment before the end to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Stories like this one deserve to be heard. Declan had been passing through Calverton, Virginia, for what he told himself was 48 hours. That was 6 days ago. He had come because his discharge papers listed a forwarding address here, and because the VA had said the transition counselor was good, and because he had not been able to think of another direction to drive. He had $1,700 left, and a German shepherd named Sargent, and a duffel bag in the truck bed, and he had left Lejeune 3 months before the date he had planned on, because his commanding officer had told him he needed to take the medical leave or the course would make that decision for him. He was 38 years old, and he had been a Marine for 16 years, and he did not know what came next. Sargent had come with him from the working dog program. The shepherd was 8 years old, black and sable coloring on a lean and capable frame, with one ear that had been fractured at the tip from a training injury 8 years prior, giving it a slight forward cant that made him look permanently curious about whatever he was looking at. He weighed 72 pounds, and he moved like something that had been engineered rather than born. When Declan had walked out of the kennel with his discharge paperwork and Sargent had simply walked beside him, as if the decision had already been made, no one at the program had stopped them. The handler coordinator had looked the other way, and the kennel director had said very quietly that the dog was medically retired anyway. And that was that. Declan had not asked what he was supposed to do with a retired military working dog when he himself could not figure out what he was supposed to do. He had found the house on his second day in Calverton. He had been walking Sargent along the residential streets near the motel where he was staying, and an elderly man had been sitting on the yellow porch alone, watching the street with the fixed attention of someone who was waiting for something and had stopped expecting it to arrive. The man had seen Sargent and stood up from his chair with a stiffness that belonged to a much older body than the one Declan had expected to stand, and he had come to the porch railing and said, in a voice that carried across the leaf-covered yard, that was a fine-looking animal. They had talked for 45 minutes. The man's name was Harold Price, and he was 74 years old, and he had spent 30 years as a structural engineer for the state and 12 more years after retirement volunteering with a veterans housing nonprofit that his wife had started after their son, Corporal Dennis Price of the United States Marine Corps, had been killed at 26 years old during his second deployment. Declan had not asked the name of the nonprofit. He had not needed to. Harold Price stood 5'10" and had a build that had once been solid and was now whittled down by the kind of weight loss that happens slowly over years when someone stops eating full meals, because full meals are something you made for two. His hair was white and cut short, marine adjacent by habit. His hands were large and calloused, in the particular way of someone who had spent a life measuring and lifting and building, and they shook slightly when he reached over the porch railing to let Sargent sniff his knuckles. The shepherd held still, and then pressed the top of his head against the old man's hand, and Harold closed his eyes for a moment. "He does that when he trusts you," Declan said. Harold looked at the dog for a long time. Then he looked at Declan. "Come inside," he said. "I have coffee on." That had been 5 days ago. Since then, Declan had returned every afternoon, and he had replaced 2 rotten porch boards and patched a section of gutter that was pulling away from the fascia. And Harold had told him about the house and about Dennis and about a man named Hargrove Colton. And each time Harold said that name, Sargent went still in the particular way he went still when something in the environment was not right. Hargrove Colton was a name Declan came to understand the way you understand weather before it arrives. Harold's wife, Ruth, had died 14 months ago. She had handled the finances, the mail, the property taxes, the accounts, the small machinery of keeping a household running, while Harold had handled the physical maintenance of the house and their mutual insistence on not needing help from anyone. After Ruth died, Harold had not opened the mail for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, a notice from Albemarle County about a property tax assessment had arrived and gone unanswered. A follow-up arrived and went unanswered. A third notice, certified, arrived while Harold was at the cemetery on the anniversary of Dennis's deployment date, and he did not pick it up from the post office because he did not know it was there. The delinquency had compounded. The county had placed the property on an accelerated tax lien schedule, a procedure Declan had never heard of, and a company called Colton Civic Asset Solutions had purchased the tax lien for $4,900 on the county's behalf. Then Colton had knocked on Harold's door. Harold described Colton as a man in his mid-40s who dressed like a lawyer and talked like a salesman, with a practiced sympathy in his voice that sat wrong in the air the way cigarette smoke sits wrong in a room after someone has tried to ventilate it. He had arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and told Harold that the county had transferred the lien to his firm, and that Harold had a legal right to redeem the property within 60 days by paying the lien amount, plus accrued interest and fees, which at that point totaled $11,200. Harold had not had $11,200. Harold had the house, a Social Security payment, and a small pension from the state engineering office that covered his utility bills and groceries. He had no savings to speak of because the savings had gone to Ruth's medical bills in the last 2 years of her life, and Harold had not told anyone that. Colton had come back 3 times over the following weeks. Each time the number was higher. Each time Colton expressed regret that Harold had not been able to resolve the situation. Each time he left behind paperwork that Harold, who had spent 30 years reading structural engineering documents and was not stupid, found deliberately difficult to parse. Legal language stacked on top of county procedural language stacked on top of fee schedules that made the true redemption cost impossible to verify without an attorney. Harold had not been able to afford an attorney. Declan had asked Harold, on the second day they talked, whether the house was the one Harold and Ruth had bought when they were first married. Harold had said yes, 41 years ago. They had saved for the down payment for 3 years, and Dennis had been born in the upstairs bedroom. Declan had not said anything for a moment. Sargent was lying across Harold's feet under the kitchen table, which Harold had accepted as if the shepherd had always done it. "Has Colton filed for foreclosure yet?" Declan asked. Harold looked at the table. "He filed last month. Auction set for Tuesday." That was 4 days before the gavel came down. In those 4 days, Declan had not slept more than 6 hours total. He drove the 12 miles to the community college library on Thursday morning before it opened, and waited in the parking lot with the engine running and Sargent fogging the passenger window with his breath. When a reference librarian named Phil unlocked the front door at 8, Declan was the first person through it. He asked about county tax code, and Phil, who had the bespectacled patience of someone who has spent a career directing other people toward answers, led him to a shelf of state municipal code volumes and left him there with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil. He filled 6 pages. He visited the county assessor's office and the county clerk's office and the courthouse records room, and he asked questions with the careful precision of someone who had spent 16 years learning that the difference between a good outcome and a bad one usually came down to who had done their homework beforehand. The woman at the assessor's office, a clerk in her early 40s named Deborah, looked at him the first time with the mild wariness of someone who has been asked leading questions before. But by the second visit, she had started pulling files for him before he finished his sentences, and by the third she had said, in a careful monotone that indicated she was not saying anything official, that she had seen this lane schedule used before, and it moved faster than most people realized. What he found was not complicated, once he knew where to look. Colton Civic Asset Solutions had purchased tax liens on 14 properties in Albemarle County in the past 3 years. 9 of those properties had gone to auction. Of those 9 auctions, Colton's firm had been the winning bidder at 8 of them, purchasing properties at lien value plus a small premium, then reselling them within 6 months at current market value. The average profit per property was $41,000. The previous owners had received nothing beyond the redemption of their original lien obligation, which in every case was a fraction of the property's value. All of this was legal, every step of it. The 14th property, Harold's house, had been appraised by the county at $212,000. On Sunday evening, Declan drove to the diner on Route 11 called Beulah's that he had eaten breakfast at twice since arriving in Calverton. The owner was a woman in her late 50s named Vera Oakes, with short gray hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead like a second set of eyes, and a way of moving through her diner that made it clear she had been doing this for a long time and had arrived at a genuine peace with the fact. She had talked to Declan on his second visit when she noticed Sargent waiting in the truck, and she had brought a bowl of water outside herself. Declan sat at the counter and told Vera the short version, which still took 20 minutes. Vera listened without interrupting, which was a quality Declan had learned to notice in people. The diner was nearly empty by the time he finished talking. One other customer sat at the far end of the counter, a man in work boots who had been nursing the same cup of coffee since before Declan arrived and who appeared to be neither listening nor not listening. The fluorescent lights over the pie case buzzed faintly at a pitch that Declan's ear caught without his brain registering it, the kind of ambient detail you absorb without deciding to. "I know Harold," Vera said. "His wife used to bring pie in here every Christmas, apple, and something with blackberries." She paused. "I didn't know about any of this." "He doesn't tell people." "No." She looked at the counter. "Dennis used to sit right where you're sitting. He was in 4th grade, and he would order the same thing every time, a grilled cheese and a root beer, and he would eat half of it and bring the other half home for his dog." She picked up a dish towel and turned it in her hands without using it. I went to his funeral. Half this town did. Declan did not say anything. Outside, through the front window, Birch Street was dark, and the November wind was pushing a single brown leaf in circles under the streetlight. "What do you need?" Vera asked. Declan had a list. He needed someone to place a bid at the auction. He had found a clause in the county's tax lien statute that allowed a third-party bidder to pay the outstanding lien amount plus fees at auction and acquire the property, with the previous owner retaining a 60-day right of first refusal to repurchase at the auction clearing price. The clause had been written into the statute in 1987, and Colton, or Colton's attorney, appeared not to have accounted for it, because in all 14 prior cases, no one had shown up to bid against Colton's firm. No one had known to look. No one had known the clause was there. The redemption amount now, with Colton's accumulated fees, stood at $18,400. Declan had $1,700. He needed the rest. Vera took off her reading glasses and set them on the counter. "How many people does Harold know in this town?" she asked. "A lot," Declan said. "He's lived here 41 years. People who knew Dennis? Some. His old unit sent a card when Dennis died. A few of them are local." Vera put her glasses back on. She picked up her phone from under the counter. "Go get some sleep," she said. "Be back here at 7 tomorrow morning." He was back at 7. There were 9 people already seated at Beulah's, and by 7:30 there were 15. Vera had called the members of the local American Legion post, 2 of whom had served alongside Dennis Price's first sergeant, and all of whom had known Harold through the Veterans Housing nonprofit. She had also called the county commissioner's assistant, a young woman named Pam, who had grown up 3 houses from Harold and Ruth, and told Vera she would be there, and she was in the corner booth, writing something in a small notebook with the focused attention of someone who understands that what she is witnessing is the kind of thing you write down. A retired schoolteacher named Gwendolyn Bass, who had taught Dennis in the 5th grade and had attended his military funeral and had kept a photograph of his class on her wall for 26 years, was at the counter with a checkbook open. A man named Carl Yetter, who ran the hardware store on Birch Street and had sold Harold roofing materials 4 years ago on a handshake credit arrangement that Harold had paid back in full within 90 days, was at the back table, with his arms crossed and a look on his face that Declan recognized. It was the look of someone who had decided. There was coffee, and there was no noise of the kind that comes from crowds. There was the sound of people talking at low volume, and the scrape of a chair, and Vera moving behind the counter. And there was the quality in the room of people who have been given something to do with their feelings about a thing they have been watching happen and have not known how to stop. By 9 in the morning, Vera had the funds, $18,400, gathered from 11 people in less than 2 hours, sitting in an envelope on the counter at Beulah's Diner. Declan had not expected it to happen that fast. He had planned for it to take until evening. "People loved Ruth," Vera said simply, when he looked at the envelope. And Harold wouldn't ask. He drove to the courthouse with the envelope in his jacket pocket and Sergeant in the passenger seat, and he parked across the street from the yellow house and waited. The auction was held on the courthouse steps, as county law required. The morning was cold enough that Declan could see his breath, and the courthouse steps were damp from a frost that had not fully melted. There were 7 people in attendance, which Declan understood was unusual. Most county tax auctions drew the lien holder and a recorder and no one else. These 7 included 2 men Declan did not know, a woman from the county clerk's office with a clipboard, and a man in a wool overcoat standing with practiced calm at the front of the small group. Colton was 47 years old and looked like a photograph of a successful person, rather than a successful person. He was 6 feet tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that was slightly too sharp to be friendly, and he wore the overcoat the way men wear overcoat, who have decided that the coat communicates something they want, communicated before they speak. He had a briefcase that Declan was certain contained documentation for a foregone conclusion. His attorney stood 2 steps behind him with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the recorder with the focused neutrality of someone who has learned to keep his face empty at proceedings like this one. Sargent sat at Declan's heel on the sidewalk across the street. He was watching the courthouse steps with his ears forward and his body very still. He had not moved since Declan stopped the truck. Sargent looked at Colton from the truck. He did not make a sound. His ears came forward, and he held himself very still, and he did not look away. The county recorder read the property address and the minimum bid threshold aloud. Colton raised one hand with the ease of a man at a ritual he had performed many times. 18,400, Colton said. The recorder noted it. A pause. Declan was already out of the truck. Sargent walked beside him across Birch Street and up the 3 courthouse steps, and the small group parted slightly without meaning to. The way people part when they sense something has shifted in a room they thought was settled. 19,000, Declan said. The recorder looked up. Colton turned. He looked at Declan, the way men look at something that is not supposed to be there. Then he looked at Sargent, and something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite irritation, but sat in the neighborhood of both. Sir, are you registered to bid? Declan handed the recorder the registration form he had filed at the clerk's office the previous afternoon. The recorder reviewed it and nodded. Colton's practiced calm adjusted itself by a degree, Declan noticed, and the recorder did not. 20,000, Colton said. 21. A beat. 25,000. Declan looked at the envelope in his jacket pocket. He looked at the yellow house across the street. He thought about a man sitting on a porch, waiting for something he had stopped expecting to arrive, and a woman who had brought apple pie and something with blackberries to a diner every Christmas for how many years, and a flagpole with a flag that was still being maintained by someone who did not have the money to redeem a tax lien. 26, Declan said. He did not have $26,000. He had 19,400 and change, which was the envelope plus what remained of his own money. The statute clause he had found was specific, and he had read it 4 times, and he had read it once more to Vera over the phone the previous night, and she had said to him, "You understand what that clause means in practice, right?" And Declan had said he did. The clause meant that the previous owner retained the right to repurchase the property from the auction winner at the auction clearing price within 60 days. Colton, if he won, would expect Harold to be unable to exercise that right because Harold had no money. Harold was not the relevant party anymore, technically, because the 11 people who had pooled their money at Beulah's diner that morning were prepared to fund that repurchase if Declan won. And Declan winning at $26,000 meant Harold could buy his own house back for $26,000 and change rather than having it sold out from under him at market value. The difference between $26,000 and $212,000 was Colton's entire business model. Colton raised his bid to 28. Declan went to 29. Something shifted in Colton's face. Not panic. Colton was not a man who panicked. It was the recalibration of someone who has walked into a room and found the furniture rearranged in a way that changes the use of the space. He looked at Declan with the focused attention of someone cataloging a new variable. 30,000, Colton said. Declan looked at the recorder. Can you clarify the right of first refusal statute for previous owners? Section 47, subsection D of the County Tax Code. The recorder, a young woman in her late 20s with the organized efficiency of someone who had studied for this job, looked at her clipboard. She found the relevant section. She read it aloud. A long moment. Colton's attorney, who had been standing 2 steps back with the stillness of someone who does everything he is not supposed to do at a public auction, spoke quietly near Colton's ear. Colton listened. Then he looked at the house across the street. And then he looked at Declan, and something moved behind his eyes that was the acknowledgement of arithmetic. 30,000, Colton said, steady. Declan could feel the envelope in his jacket. 19,400. He was 13,000 short of matching Colton at 30, and they both knew it. He looked at the yellow house. Then he heard a door. Vera Oakes was crossing Birch Street. Behind her was Carl Yetter. Behind Carl was Gwendolyn Bass, who was 81 years old and moved with 2 canes and was moving faster than Declan had seen a person move with 2 canes. Behind her were 4 other people from Beulah's that morning, and behind them were 3 more people Declan had not met, and behind them, walking slowly with the careful balance of someone who had recently been told by a doctor to be careful, was Harold. Harold crossed the street in his heavy coat and a knit cap that was slightly too large for his head, and he came up the courthouse steps and stood next to Declan, and he did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the house he had lived in for 41 years. He looked at the flagpole. He looked at Colton. Sergeant pressed against Harold's leg. "I'd like to exercise my statutory right to bid on my own property," Harold said to the recorder, with the careful precision of an engineer who has spent a career being exact. The recorder checked her clipboard again. Vera stepped forward and handed the recorder a second envelope. "Additional community funds," she said. "Documented source." Gwendolyn was at the recorder's elbow with a handwritten accounting sheet that itemized every contribution by name and amount, which Gwendolyn had apparently prepared that morning with the completeness of a woman who had taught 5th grade for 34 years and understood that documentation mattered. Colton looked at his attorney. His attorney made no visible expression. The total community fund now sitting in the recorder's hands was $31,800. $31,800, Harold said quietly. The recorder waited the required interval. Colton looked at the house. He looked at the group of people on the courthouse steps. He looked at Declan and at Sargent, and the look on his face at that moment was the look of a man who has made a calculation he does not like the result of, but cannot argue with. He did not raise his bid. The gavel came down a second time that morning. It was a quieter sound than the first one. Carl let out a breath that was not quite a sound. Gwendolyn covered her mouth with one hand. Vera looked at the sidewalk for a moment and then looked up at the November sky as if checking on something. Harold stood very still. He was looking at the house. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has prepared himself for one thing and is now recalibrating for something else, something he had not let himself prepare for because preparation would have required him to believe it was possible. Sargent pressed harder against his leg. "All right," Harold said, to no one in particular. His voice was very low. "All right." The gavel came down a second time, and the sound of it was the same physical fact as the first time, but carried a completely different weight. The way the same word spoken twice can mean 2 different things depending on everything that has happened between the first and second utterance. Harold stood on the top step with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the yellow house. He had the expression of a man who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact is itself something that has to be absorbed slowly. Carl shook Harold's hand. Gwendolyn took Harold's arm with both of hers and said something to him, too quietly for Declan to hear. Vera stood back a few steps with her hands in her coat pockets, and she looked at Declan for a moment across the small crowd, and what she communicated in that look was something that did not require language. Colton walked to his car without speaking to anyone. His attorney followed. Neither of them looked back. Over the following weeks, the story of what had happened on the Albemarle County Courthouse steps circulated through Calverton, the way true things circulate in small towns, which is to say quickly and accurately and with a kind of collective, quiet satisfaction that does not need to be spoken aloud because everyone already feels it. Gwendolyn had photographed the auction with her phone from the moment Declan crossed the street, and the images existed. Carl had recorded the recorder's reading of the statute clause on his phone, a precaution he had thought of himself after Declan had explained the plan to the group at Beulah's the morning before. Two men from the American Legion Post, who had attended the auction, had introduced themselves to Declan afterward and said they wanted to contact a journalist at the regional paper, and Declan had said that was their choice to make, not his. The journalist, a young man named Perry Dunn, who covered local government for the Calverton Courier, spent 3 weeks reviewing the county tax lien records. He found the 14 properties. He found the pattern. He found that in 6 of the 9 prior auctions, the previous owners had been elderly, widowed, or recently bereaved, and that the fee structures Colton had applied had been calculated at the maximum rate permitted by county code, which was not illegal, but was a choice, and Perry Dunn wrote the difference between what Colton had paid for the liens and what he had cleared on the resales in a table that ran on the front page of the Courier the first week of December. It was $31,000 for the liens, $408,000 in property resale proceeds. Colton did not respond to the Courier's request for comment. Colton's Civic Asset Solutions website was taken down within 48 hours of the story running. 2 of the prior property owners were subsequently located by Perry, and both retained legal counsel to review their cases. None of that had been Declan's plan. His plan had been narrower and simpler, the way the best plans always are. Get to the courthouse on Tuesday morning, show up, bid, that was all. The rest had grown from that, the way things grow when the ground is prepared and someone decides to act. Harold repurchased the house on the 43rd day of the statutory window, using the community fund plus a personal loan from the American Legion Post that he would pay back at $200 a month for the next 12 years. He had the documentation reviewed by a legal aid attorney from Charlottesville who had been connected to them by Gwendolyn through a contact at the community college, and the attorney confirmed the repurchase was clean and the property title was restored to Harold without encumbrance. Harold shook the attorney's hand at the front door and watched the man's car pull away from the curb, and then he came inside and sat down at the kitchen table, in the chair he always sat in, which was the chair that faced the window over the sink, which was the window Ruth had stood at every morning while the coffee was brewing. He sat there for a long time without saying anything. The kitchen was quiet around him, the way kitchens are quiet in houses that have been lived in long enough to hold their own silence. Sargent lay across Harold's feet under the table, his weight settled and steady, and Harold kept his eyes on the window. That had been enough. In December, Declan helped Harold replace the remaining 2 rotten porch boards and repaint the front steps with a paint that Harold had kept in the garage for 3 years without opening, because Ruth had bought it before she got sick and Harold had not been able to open it after. The can had 2 coats of dust on the lid. Harold had carried it to the garage and set it on the shelf above the workbench on the day he came home from the hardware store without her, and he had not gone back to the shelf for the paint because going back to the shelf meant acknowledging what the paint was for. He handed the can to Declan without explaining any of that. Declan accepted it without asking. It was a gray-green color that Ruth had found in a magazine and thought would look good against the yellow of the clapboard siding, and it did. They worked for 3 days on the porch, morning into afternoon, in the specific cold of early Virginia December that is not yet brutal, but makes itself felt in the hands and in the joints of older men. Harold measured twice before cutting anything, a habit from 30 years of engineering that he applied to every task regardless of scale, and Declan held the boards while Harold secured them with the steady, methodical precision of someone for whom doing a thing correctly was not separable from the act of doing it at all. In that time, Harold talked about Ruth and about Dennis in the way people talk when they have been holding something and have decided they can set it down for a little while. He talked about Dennis's Little League games and about the summer he had taught Dennis to read a building blueprint, and about the day Dennis had come home from boot camp and stood in the kitchen doorway in his uniform, and Harold had found that he could not speak for several seconds. Declan listened. He was good at listening, which was something he had not known about himself until recently. On the last afternoon of the porch work, Harold brought out 2 mugs of coffee, and they sat on the newly painted steps in the cold air, and Harold said, without preamble, "Where are you going after this?" Declan looked down the street. Sargent was in the yard, nose down in the leaves near the flagpole, investigating something with the focused attention he brought to everything. "Haven't decided," Declan said. Harold wrapped both hands around his mug. "There's an apartment above the garage," he said. "Been empty 4 years? Heat works. It's not much." Declan looked at him. "I'm not offering charity," Harold said, which was the tone of a man who had never offered charity in his life, and intended to be clear about that. "The garage needs rewiring. I've been putting it off, and there's a section of the south fence that's going to need work come spring." He paused. "A man with a dog needs somewhere to put the dog." Sargent looked up from the leaves. He looked at Declan with the patient waiting quality that had been the first thing Declan noticed about him, the first time the dog had sat down next to him in the kennel and simply waited to see what Declan was going to do. Declan thought about $1,700 and no forwarding address, and a direction he had not been able to name. He thought about standing on courthouse steps with an envelope and a dog and a statute clause, and the specific feeling of not being the only one standing there. "I can look at the wiring," Declan said. Harold nodded once, as if that settled it, because in his understanding of the world it did. The garage apartment was small and smelled like old wood and motor oil, which were smells Declan had always found more comfortable than the alternatives. The heater worked. There was a window that looked out over the backyard and through the bare November trees toward a ridgeline that caught the early light before anything else in town did. The first morning, Declan stood at that window with his coffee and watched the light come down the ridge, and Sargent sat beside him and watched it too, ears forward. He did not think about where he was going. On the last Sunday before Christmas, Vera brought a pie to Harold's door, apple and something with blackberries, and Harold stood in the doorway and held the pie for a long moment without saying anything, and then he said, very quietly, that Ruth used to make one like that, and Vera said she knew, which was why she had, and Harold stepped back to let her in. Declan was in the kitchen, fixing the hinge on a cabinet door that had been sticking for years, and Sargent was in the corner with his head up, watching everyone with the attentiveness of a creature who has taken responsibility for a space and is pleased with what he finds there. Carl arrived an hour later with his wife and 2 daughters. Gwendolyn arrived after that with her grandson, who was 7 years old, and immediately asked Sargent a serious question about whether the dog could shake hands, and Sargent, to everyone's surprise, extended his right paw. Gwendolyn's grandson shook it with enormous gravity, and then reported to the room that the handshake was firm and professional, which made Harold laugh, which was the first time Declan had heard that sound come from Harold. It sounded like a door opening. The afternoon went long. Declan fixed the cabinet hinge and then helped Carl move a heavy bookshelf. And at some point, without quite deciding to, he stopped being a person passing through and became a person who was present, which was a different thing entirely. Near 4 o'clock, with the light going flat and gold outside the kitchen window and the noise of people filling the old house in a way it had not been filled for a long time, Harold found Declan in the hallway. "You staying for dinner?" Harold asked. Declan looked at the kitchen, at the people moving around in it, at Sargent sitting in his spot by the corner, at the light coming through the window Ruth had once looked through while making pie. "Yeah," Declan said. "I'm staying." Harold looked at him for a moment. He did not smile exactly. Something in his face arranged itself into an expression that was older and quieter and more real than a smile. He put a hand briefly on Declan's shoulder and went back into the kitchen. There are people in this world who stand up when no one asks them to. They drive to towns they were only passing through. They file paperwork in county offices and sit in law libraries and knock on doors at 7 in the morning because someone needs them to. And they do it not because they expect anything, but because something in the marrow of them does not know how to look away. You know people like that. You may be one yourself, or you may have been kept safe by one in a moment you did not fully see until later. What happened on those courthouse steps did not make the national news. It did not need to. It was a small thing in the exact shape of what it needed to be, in a town that remembered it and will keep remembering it. A dog pressed against an old man's leg. An envelope in a jacket pocket. 11 people at a diner counter who decided at 7 in the morning that enough was enough. The things worth saving are usually saved like that, quietly and together by people who show up. May you find those people when you need them. May you be one when someone else does. May the ground beneath the places you love hold firm, and may God bless you and keep you and everyone under your roof.